Good afternoon.
This is the Institute of Black Culture. Do you want to do that again? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Dr. John Johnson. I'm the director of the Institute of Black Culture. And I want to welcome you all to Black Thought. You can hear me in the back. No, you can't hear me. This is Black Thought, our distinguished lecture series. We do this series every other Friday or so. And we use it to really feature and to celebrate the profound intellectual scholarship that's happening at our university. We have a number of black graduate students, scholars, faculty who are doing tremendous work that we don't even showcase enough of. So we try to showcase it here at the Institute of Black Culture. We have, I don't have the schedule for the remainder of the semester with me, but they're typically at 12 o'clock on Fridays, but we didn't want to compete with the wonderful panel discussion on the health that was happening today over at USTA. So we pushed our event back to 2:30 today. Normally we're here at 12 o'clock on every other Friday. So today we're blessed to have Justin Dunnavant. He's here to talk about archaeology and the Black experience. So Justin is a graduate or alumni of Howard University in Washington, D.C. He got a bachelor's degree in history and anthropology. And now he's in the second year graduate student in the Department of Anthropology with specialization in archaeology of Africa and the African diaspora. So I'm turning it over now to Justin Dunnavant.
Just want to say thank you all for coming out. It's a lot more people than I expected it to be. But I guess that's good. Keeps me on my toes. Let's thank Dr. Johnson and the IBC for putting this together. I've seen a lot of progression in the IBC in the short 2 years I've been here. This is definitely a good move forward. Yep. I'd also like to thank BJSO for helping put this together as well. Again, with the future, there's more people in the future. Alright, so I initially gave this paper about a week ago in Atlanta at a National Council of Black Studies conference. And when I did it, I more so read a paper. But I realized most of y'all are archaeologists, and most of you probably don't want to hear me read a paper. And I know with the blinds and everything being low, that's conducive to the people going to sleep. So I decided to make it a little more engaging and to just kind of make it more of a conversation. As I said, this is ongoing research I'm working on doing, trying to get at these histories of blacks in archaeology. We're very underrepresented and undocumented in the dominant literature, so we're going to try to bring it out in some non-bounded spaces. During the course of the lecture, I'm going to drop a lot of names. So if you guys have a pen and a pad, you want to start writing stuff down, please do. If you need me to slow down, let me know. Some of them are going to be archaeologists, some of them aren't. And a lot of them, I'm sure, relate to research that some of you guys are doing as well. Postmodern studies in English, we have anthropologists, urban planning. Can I see better? If I can see better? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Alright, so the title of my presentation is The Negro Digs Up His Past, Archaeology and the Black Experience. Now I know the title can kind of sound a little controversial. I actually chose this title because it relates specifically to an article, which I'll refer to in a little bit. But I didn't mean it to sound androcentric. There are plenty of women who dug as well, and there are a lot of women in archaeology, so I just want y'all to know that. Alright, so the title actually comes from an article written by this man. Anybody know who this is? He is Puerto Rican. Good. Anybody else know anything about him? No. Okay.
We got a center in Harlem here.
Library center in Harlem. Good, good, good. Dr. Toro Schomburg was actually born to an Afro-Puerto Rican mother and a German father in Puerto Rico. He was raised in Puerto Rico. Ended up coming to Harlem, and he was very interested in uncovering this whole idea of black history or black past. So he's known as a bibliophile today, fancy word for librarian. And what he did was he actually helped found the Negro Society for Historical Research in Harlem. Again, these are organizations that you don't really hear about, but they were very instrumental in training a lot of early black scholars. He worked as an employee at the New York Public Library, and actually in 1926, he actually donated his private collection to the library, and he created the Schomburg Center today. I know many of you complain when your professors give you a book to read. This man had over 5,000 in his collection, plus 3,000 manuscripts, plus another 2,000 candidate sketches. He then sold that to the New York Public Library for $10,000. A lot of money back in the 1920s. And used it to travel to... He used that money to then travel throughout Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean to gather more primary documents on black. So this man made it a lifetime commitment to the study of black life and culture. As I said, you might know the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. It's currently located in Harlem. It's one of the largest repositories for information on black people across the world. It started initially with his primary documents, but then grew. There's over 10 million sources in this library today. And this image right here is very powerful. This is actually a rendition of Langston Hughes' The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and it's done in the style of Chicago cosmogram. And you see the rivers, the various rivers, Euphrates River, Mississippi River that he talks about in this poem. He used to make up the cosmogram. And actually underneath this is located in the center of the Schomburg Center. So underneath the floor of this are the ashes of Langston Hughes. So it's very instrumental, very influential. But let me get back to the topic at hand. The Negro digs up his past. This was written in 1925 by Arthur Schomburg. And in it, he talked about the importance of restoring black history, not just for black people, but to restore its place in world history. And he said it is imperative that we use this history to restore what slavery took away. He said the American Negro must remake the past in order to make his future. This was actually so influential. John Henrik Clark, famous historian, said that this article was the impetus to him leaving his hometown in Columbus, Georgia, and traveling to Harlem to meet Arthur Schomburg. If you guys have any questions during the course of the presentation, feel free to stop me. Go back to the So this whole idea of restoring history is a central theme throughout the presentation, which is why I entitled it The Negro Digs Up His Past. So let's talk about archaeology in North America. Most dominant textbooks will talk about archaeology starting in North America. This man right here, former President Thomas Jefferson. He conducted what is believed to be the first scientific archaeological excavations in America, somewhere between 1770 and 1783. He conducted excavations on his Monticello plantation, and he excavated a Native American burial mound to better understand Native American burial practices. He talked about it in his book, Notes on Virginia, I believe it's the title, just a little bit. But very few people mention the people who actually dug the site, which were the enslaved Africans on his plantation, which would have looked more like this man as well as the women. These were the people actually that dug the trenches. They took the measurements and they collected the data. So we can see that the history of African Americans and archaeology in North America are very interconnected. You got a question about that?
Why did they just wanted to dig just to dig, or was there a reason?
Well, no. Jefferson wanted to dig because he wanted to learn about the Native American burial mounds on his plantation. He wanted to try to understand Native American burial mounds.
Oh, so he knew it was there already.
Yeah, he saw it was there. These mounds were clear on the surface. He didn't know what he would find. Of course, he got them to do. Big surprise.
And what did he do with the things that he found? Did he save them?
I'm not sure what actually happened to the artifacts that he uncovered. They could be in a private collection on the Monticello plantation right now. They actually have a research laboratory on his plantation today. And ironically, also in that research lab is what they call DAX, the Digital Archive for Archaeological Research for the African Diaspora or something like that. So they actually have sites related to the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean populations located on the plantation today. So it's kind of interesting reappropriation of historical space.
Did you say he wrote it up, the digging in his...
Yeah, he mentioned it in his notes for Virginia. Yeah, but he doesn't provide a whole lot of background into what went on. So that's fine. All right, we'll skip ahead a little bit. George McJunkin. This was a prominent man. He wasn't an archaeologist, but he did something very significant for archaeology. He was actually born enslaved in a small town near Midway, Texas, 1851. He was then freed at the age of 14 after the Civil War, and he was probably known as being a prominent black cowboy. He was fluent in Spanish. He was known for his ability to capture capture cattle, hunt bison, and so forth. So what happened was, at the age of 14, he actually left Texas with cattle, I think they call it a cattle run, and then went to New Mexico. He stayed there, lived there throughout his time there. Now there's some controversy over the story into how he found this archaeological site, but it's generally believed that in 1908 there was a flood in New Mexico. A number of people died, about 15. During that flood, he went around trying to locate survivors. He then stumbled across what he found to be remains of an old buffalo, bison. The issue was nobody took him seriously. He went and actually contacted archaeological officials and said, look, I found this thing, I think it's really old, you should check it out. It wasn't actually further explored until after he died in 1922. But when it was explored and when research was done, some significant things were found. Actually, prior to this, researchers believed that Native Americans had inhabited North America somewhere about 2000, 3000 BC. Because of this site, they actually were able to date these bones back to about 9000 BC. And this small Folsom point right here is believed to be a product of Native American craftsmanship. So then they were able to tie it in and say, well, if this bone is about 90,000 or 9,000 BC, then we can then date Native American habitation into North America back that far. So it really pushed back the chronology of when North America became populated by about 7,000 years. He's also important because he stresses another point I want to bring up. There are many people that are involved in archaeology that don't necessarily have degrees in it. And many of them work on these excavations but don't get recognition. And so I think it's important that people like McJunkin and others get recognition for their work. His recognition came about late after his death. But I think we can begin to talk more about some of the people that work with us in the field. That's another project I'll talk about probably a little bit later. Let's move forward a little bit more. John Wesley Gilbert. He is believed to be the first professionally trained black archaeologist. He was born in 1864, a small town in Georgia. His parents were sharecroppers, so he grew up a lot actually picking cotton and splitting rails. After he completed grade school, he then went on to Atlanta Baptist Seminary, which then became the theological department at Morehouse College. He attended there for about a year or so, and then he left and went to the newly founded Payne College in rural Georgia. At Payne College, he became the first student to graduate. From there, he was awarded a partial scholarship to attend Brown University, which I'm sure some people know, and he received his master's degree in classics, 1891. His MA dissertation thesis was entitled The Deans of Attica, which are the villages of Attica, an ancient site. And from there, he was awarded another scholarship, the Athens Scholarship, to then go on to Greece and to study archaeology at the American College. And he was the first African American to attend the American College in Athens, Greece. During his time in Greece, he excavated and took measurements and produced what became the only map of the site of Eritrea. Now, this is not the country, but this is actually an archaeological site, very significant, located off of mainland Greece. From here, he also then went on to Germany, where he, Eritrea, it's E-R-E-T-R-I-A. And from here, he went on to Germany. He went to the University of Berlin, 1891. This is significant because this is actually a year before Du Bois arrives in Berlin. So Du Bois was not the first African American to study at the University of Berlin. We actually have some writings over. After his time in Berlin, he then returned to the States. He returned to his alma mater, actually. He became the first African American professor at Payne College. Eventually appointed to Dean of Theology, and then later on transferred and spent a short tenure at the historically black college, Miles College in Alabama, and he was president there as well. From there, he then went on, he actually traveled to Africa, and he worked to set up Methodist missions in the Congo. He started out in Senegal, and from Senegal he traveled inland to the Congo. He came back to the States, and he passed away in 1923 from what is believed to be complications that he developed during his time there. So again, these significant people you won't hear about in your archaeology class. But the legacy of blacks in archaeology will continue until the 1930s. Many of you might be familiar with the WPA project, Workers' Progress Administration. They were responsible for collecting a lot of the oral histories of people who were enslaved. They also financed a lot of painters and artists during the Harlem Renaissance. But what they did was they were also instrumental in bringing blacks into the field of archaeology. So what happened was there were a number of black male and female who were employed to work in museums and on excavations at projects throughout Alabama, as well as in Georgia. Specifically in Georgia, the sites of Swift Creek, Macon, and Irene Mound used predominantly African-American women to do the excavations. So you can see some of these images here.
And did they explain why African-American women specifically?
Yeah, well, this is a good point. Dr. Whitney Battle-Baptiste was here on Wednesday. She's a famous African-American archaeologist woman. And she was saying part of it was because of this fact that they felt that white women were not fit to do this work. This work was too taxing. It was too burdensome for a lot of them. So what they did was they used black women. On top of that, they thought it would be a way to employ blacks and give them some type of occupation. Of course, we get a paycheck. We tend to be less rebellious, I'll just say that.
Why not black men?
Why not black men? That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't think it's been explored in depth.
Were they maybe just located on a different site? Because I know in a lot of outdoors work, when they let women become part of it, they made them separate so that there wouldn't be any mingling or whatever. So maybe the men were simultaneously working at a different site, they just didn't want them on the same.
That could be, although I know that the principal excavator at the site actually specifically requested that black women be brought onto the site. And so I'm not sure exactly why.
And this Zora Neale Hurst, is that how she got introduced through work? Because I know she was working with the Writers Project. Is that how she got introduced?
I'm not sure if this is how she got introduced,
Okay.
but I know she also worked closely with Elaine Locke. And Elaine Locke was very interested in archaeology.
Were the principal investigators white? And also, what were the social consequences of blacks doing archaeology in the Deep South at this time? Was there any type of backlash? Those are two separate questions.
Yeah, that was so the first one you said, the principal excavators were predominantly white males. On this site, there were actually 32 white females who were also working on this site. Their names are all documented, although there's no documentation for the African American. From what I understand, the women didn't have much authority on the site, although they were present. And there were women in archaeology at this time attaining higher degrees of education. To answer your question about the social implications of it, there was mention of it featured in the local newspaper, and there was some backlash. Some blacks felt that black women specifically shouldn't be doing this work because it was offensive that you would give these women hard labor to do. Other people thought it was a sign of empowerment that women would be doing jobs such as this. So, yeah, what happened was we actually don't have documentation for a lot of these women, but in 1996, some researchers came across these photos and more, and were then able to identify some of the descendants and relatives who were interviewed. So these photos and more, plus snippets of the interviews, are actually available online, so you can check them out. It provides a key insight into what it was like to do archaeology for blacks in the 1930s. They talk about wages and so forth.
What's the website?
Website is, I'll get that to you later. Yeah, I can't think off the top of my head. Push forward into contemporary times. Some of you may be familiar with this book. Anybody read it? Anybody looked at it? All right. Black people in the room? Black anthropology. It's important because for many of us, this was sort of our tone. When we thought about going into anthropology, first thing we did was went to the library, typed in African American, Afro something, archaeology, and this was the only book that came up. So this was actually written by Dr. Faye Harrison. Many of you may know, she's an anthropology department here, as well as one of her colleagues at University of Tennessee, Ira Harrison, Revelation. But late 1990s, this was published. It highlights some of the key anthropological figures, early black anthropological figures. It mentions linguists, biological anthropologists, as well as cultural anthropologists. But unfortunately, it makes no mention of blacks in archaeology. So initially I was surprised and saying, well, how can you talk about anthropology and not talk about blacks in anthropology or archaeology? But it turns out that blacks didn't formally enter archaeology until very late. Many of the people showcased in this book were in 1920s and 30s. the first professionally trained African American with a PhD in archaeology. Didn't come about till 1976. Dr. Warren Barber. Dr. Barber actually, before I go there, do any of you all know when the first blacks in your respective degrees came about? Anybody? I mean, put y'all on the spot. All right. Well, I'll put this into perspective then. 1976, he gets his PhD. This is 45 years after Lawrence Foster received the first PhD in anthropology. 56 years after Francis Sumner became the first African American with a PhD in psychology. And over a century after Edward Boucher became the first PhD in physics. So again, we're arriving very late to the field. Very late. There's much more to explore. So Warren Barber actually got his degree in 76, University of Rochester. And he did his dissertation work on ancient figurines in Mexico. 4 years later, he came with Dr. Teresa Singleton, first African-American woman to receive her PhD in archaeology. She actually got a PhD from this university back in 1980. And she's known as, I think one person referred to her as the godmother of African-American archaeology, or the mother of African-American archaeology. But she did her dissertation work on, she did the archaeological investigation of slavery in coastal Georgia. And then from there she became well-read in all of that. Lots of plantation archaeology. A lot of her work now actually deals with coffee plantations in Cuba. So she's expanding beyond simply North America. But I stress the importance of a PhD in archaeology, specifically because PhDs are very important if you wish to control not only the interpretation of the material, but also the research questions and goals that are asked and performed on these sites. Without a PhD, it's very hard to become the lead investigator on any dig, both in North America and throughout the rest of the country. So we need more African Americans, more people of African descent, more minorities, period, in archaeology. However, having said that, I want to make it known that even though we didn't have formal PhDs in archaeology, blacks have been engaged in archaeological research since way back. Martin Delaney actually published a book in 1879 entitled Principia of Ethnology, on the origins of races. And in that book, he referenced the archaeological excavations being conducted throughout Ethiopia and Egypt. He also reintroduced a theory that the Greek script was a derivative of ancient Ge'ez. And for those of you who know what Ge'ez is, it's the predecessor to what is now Amharic. So it's very controversial, but he's arguing that African influence is very prevalent in ancient Greece. Principia of Ethnology. That's P-R-I-N-C-I-P-I-A. And then ethnology is E-T-H-N-O-L-O-G-Y. And thanks to modern technology, you can actually get the whole book online. Word search it, all that good stuff. Another important figure that we'll come to is Dr. Elaine Locke. Elaine Locke was very instrumental in the Harlem Renaissance. In the 1920s, he was a professor at Howard University in the Department of Philosophy. He actually, I believe he was versed in Greek and Latin as well, studied classics. He actually studied, he was involved and engaged in archaeology on the side. Zora Hurston, when she was doing her research down here in Florida, she actually sent him samples of rock and other minerals for him to analyze. So, there's a little background history that may not be in the textbook either. But he actually went on sabbatical in 1924, and he went to Cairo, Egypt, and he was a researcher at the French Oriental Archaeological Society. And it was there he actually witnessed the reopening of King Tut's tomb. So this was actually, I believe, the first time we had an African American present at such a significant archaeological excavation. And this connection with Africa is very significant, as you'll see. We can then move on to W.B. Du Bois. Yes, he did write a book outside of Black Folk. He talked about more than the color line. But he published a book entitled The Negro in 1950. And in that, he referenced archaeological research and evidence that was being conducted in ancient Nubia. And that actually leads me to the next person who is worthy of his own slide. William Leo Hansberry. William Hansberry actually read The Negro, published by Du Bois, and became so inspired that he then went on to pursue archaeology. Do any of you know anything about William Leo Hansberry? What you know about him?
He is the uncle of Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote the play A Raisin in the Sun.
Yeah, so Dr. William Leo Hansberry. Now, his father was a historian at, I believe it was Alcorn State University. He studied history. He was versed in classics. And because of that, Hansberry had a very extensive library collection at his disposal at the time. So after reading The Negro, he went on to Atlanta University, where Du Bois was teaching, and actually mentored under Du Bois for a short period of time. From there, he transferred to Harvard University. And he didn't necessarily receive his degree in the traditional, I guess, 4-year period. He went on, he joined the military during World War I. Yes, during World War I, and had some little hiccups along the way. But without even a bachelor's degree, this man went on to teach at Straight University, what is now Dillard University. And he taught not only a course in anthropology, but he also taught a course in African archaeology. Now this is early 1900s. This is actually fall of 1920. So fall of 1920, there were barely any courses being taught in archaeology in the United States, period. I doubt there was a course being taught on African archaeology. And there definitely wasn't a course being taught on African archaeology at a historically black college. So, very significant player here. A year later, he then published an article entitled The Material Culture of Ancient Nigeria. This is again 1921. It's been argued that this is actually the first, I'm going to try to say this correctly, the first article published by an African American that deals with an ancient African civilization outside of the Nile Valley. So prior to this, people have been talking about Africa, but they hadn't discussed anything outside the Nile Valley. So again, very significant. I also want to bring up a point. At Dillard University, his title was Professor and Director of the Department of Negro History within the Social Sciences Division. Let me say that again. The Department of Negro History in 1921. Now, he went on afterwards and did a lecturing series. He lectured throughout the United States advocating for an interdisciplinary Africana Studies department. This is 28 years before Herskowitz would establish the first Department of African Studies at Northwestern University. Very significant. Actually, at this time, Herskowitz had just begun graduate school at Columbia University. So he wasn't even thinking of this level. Furthermore, to put this into perspective, San Francisco State, many of you know, is lauded as the first African American Studies department in the country. That didn't happen until 1968. So again, we have a man teaching in the Department of Negro History in 1921, and the first African American Studies department was founded in 1968. Again, University of Florida, we've had a program for what, since 1969? Somewhere around there, and we still don't have a department. But that's a debate for another time.
No stress.
Alright, to get back to the topic. Hansberry, he then went on to teach at Howard University, alma mater. And he trained a number of prominent figures during his time there. He trained Dr. John Henry Clark, who I mentioned earlier. But he was also responsible for training Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who some of you may know was the first president of Ghana. And he also trained Dr. Nnamdi Ezekwe, who was the first president of Nigeria. So again, these connections, not only is it a small world, it's a small university. He actually called openly for blacks to become more involved in anthropological and archaeological research. He said, and I quote, "There's no reason why the Negro should depend upon others to take the lead and set the standards in these investigations." Talking about archaeology and anthropology. He has schools and students and scholars in numbers quite sufficient, who might, if they but will, equip themselves to carry forward this all-important work. So again, early 1920s, he's calling for blacks to become more inclusive in anthropology and archaeology. I think it's also significant. His first year teaching at Howard University, he had, I guess it was a 3-3 course load. He taught 3 courses in the fall semester. He actually helped establish an African civilization division within the Department of History. But his first 3 courses were the Negro peoples and cultures and civilizations of prehistoric and protohistoric times, ancient civilizations of Ethiopia, and the ancient civilizations of West Africa in medieval and early modern times. Again, early 1920s, he's teaching 3 classes, all on historical civilizations in Africa. This doesn't even happen in universities today.
That was my question. Are any of those courses taught at the University of Florida today?
At University of Florida?
Yes.
To be polite, I'll say no. They do have an Egyptian civilizations course in the Class 6 department. I'm not sure what the methodology is behind it or what sources they use, but they do have that, but there's definitely nothing to the extent of ancient civilizations there. And all of these courses, by the way, heavily relied on archaeological data and archaeological sources. Hansberry was then invited by W.B. Du Bois to present the 4th Pan-African Congress, which was in New York, I believe, at the time. And he delivered a paper there entitled Archaeological History and Its Significance for Blacks. I haven't found this paper yet, but I intend to get my hands on it shortly. Hansberry then ended up going back to Harvard in 1927, and through special permission was able to complete his BA and MA concurrently. So he got his BA in history with a concentration in anthropology and a master's in anthropology. And his dissertation research was on ancient Ethiopia, so that was very significant. After completing his master's in 1932, he then went on and conducted postgraduate research. He was a postgraduate fellow both at the University of Chicago as well as at Oxford University School of Anthropology and Archaeology. And then he went on to receive a Fulbright to go to Cairo University in the mid-1950s. And he studied over 100 archaeological sites during his time. Again, you won't read about Hansberry. Although it should be known that it's not quite sure if he actually dug any excavations himself. It has been said that he was denied membership on a number of archaeological field schools because of his race. And because of that, he might not have actually got a chance to dig. He also never received his PhD, which is significant because he taught at 4-year institutions for decades. But he was actually supervised under Houghton, who was a prominent biological anthropologist at Harvard University. He actually trained Carolyn Bonday, who was one of the first significant black female anthropologists as well in the 1920s and 30s. But it's been said that he said that there was nobody qualified in the States to supervise his PhD dissertation. So he never got a PhD. All right, fast forward again. So where are we today? All right, in 1997, Dr. Maria Franklin, another prominent black African-American archaeologist, she published an article on the state of blacks in archaeology. In 1997, she counted 4 black PhDs in the discipline in the entire United States of America. Today, I would like to say that there's been great improvement, but we have about 26 black PhDs in archaeology. About. Yeah. Some of them didn't specialize completely in archaeology as well. Of that 26, 5 of them are Africans directly from the continent, and 4 of them are actually from the Caribbean. So there's a wide diversity as well. In addition to that, there are about 27 graduate students in archaeology receiving PhDs today. That includes myself, that includes Esmaret, and about 2 others here and others around the country. So, again, very small numbers. And these were actually collected from us soliciting black archaeologists, asking them, do you know of any? And they said, well, I know of these. And then it turned out to be everybody was just naming the same person over and over.
And what school are most of them attending?
Most of them, not surprisingly, actually come out under the tutelage of black archaeologists. So Dr. Maria Franklin is at University of Texas. University of Texas produced one of the highest numbers of blacks in archaeology. University of Massachusetts at one point produced a high number when Dr. Blakey was there doing the New York African Burial Ground. And the University of Florida actually produced a significant amount. Dr. Teresa Singleton right here out of his facility. And I think part of that is also due, there's also other black, there's not very many black anthropologists on faculty in these departments. So when you do find a significant number, you tend to find a significant number of black students as well.
Are there any black archaeologists from the South America area? Because you named people from Africa, Caribbean, and North America, but are there any black archaeologists below
Working in the United States, I'm not sure of any. There are several that have been trained actually in Brazil. I'm not sure of names and so forth. But I believe they're still working in Brazil, but they don't work in the United States. But that's definitely, and I'll talk about that a little more, that's something that needs to be flushed out. Alright, so the concern of the lack of blacks in archaeology has been very important for black archaeologists. However, it has warranted little attention from the larger archaeological organizations. This is disturbing considering the fact that a lot of these organizations have journals that publish significantly on African American archaeological projects. These include Archaeology, American Antiquity, and Historical Archaeology. Oftentimes, the discussion of involving blacks in archaeological research stops at collaboration and informing descending communities. Very few of them actually bring them onto their projects and actually encourage them to get PhDs in these fields. However, there are exceptions to this rule. Society of Africanist Archaeologists and the Pan-African Archaeological Association both submitted letters to Howard University in protest to their closure of their anthropology department, citing specifically the fact that we need to have more black archaeologists. So why are we so underrepresented in archaeology? There's been a number of ideas put forth. For one, it's been argued that black people simply don't know that's a career option. When people in general think about archaeology, they think about Indiana Jones, Laura Croft, if they play those games, and they think of dinosaurs, which we don't do. So many people are just unaware of it. Another idea that's been put forth is this idea of poor financial and career outlook. I'm not going to lie, we don't make a lot of money. We don't intend to make a lot of money. So if you're trying to make money, you're probably not going to become an archaeologist. But Dr. Agni Davies, who's another black archaeologist, has argued that this isn't a sufficient answer because there are a number of prominent black scholars in sociology, history, political science, and so forth. And of course, they're not looking at a lot of money either. Instead, she argues that the reason for the lack of blacks in archaeology is this idea of a lack of perceived social impact. Many people go into history, sociology, political science because they see it directly related to issues that they see in their environments. People don't necessarily see that in archaeology. Although it is there, and I encourage you all to read this book, Black Feminist Archaeology. Dr. Millie Valenti, she was just here. But she cites it as her impetus and her reason for dealing with archaeology. So this is more of a sort of autobiographical piece that she did on her experience. Seneca Drake also noted that he chose to pursue archaeology, or he chose to pursue a career in anthropology because he said, we believe the discipline had relevance to the liberation of black people from the devastating consequences of over 400 years of white racism. And this was in a prominent journal back in 1978. That's what he said. Alright, so why is there a need to get more blacks in archaeology? For one, it's been shown that African Americans, people of African descent, tend to focus on research directly related to the experiences and to the issue that they see in their community. I went on ProQuest and pulled up every dissertation for every black archaeologist I could, and of that, the only one that didn't deal with African American, or African diasporic archaeology was Dr. Warren Baber, the first archaeologist who was researching ancient Mexico. And I would probably venture to say today that Baber has done work to some degree on blacks in archaeology. Another reason why we need more is the current socio-political climate. Alright, the physical remains and grave goods of African Americans and people of African descent around the world are in museums and are on tour around many of these countries. People are making money off of them through exhibits and so forth. In addition, a lot of these sites are endangered. Some of you may have heard recently about them coming across an African burial ground in Brazil and they're trying to do construction for the Olympics. That happened recently. And they actually just recently found an enslaved cemetery on the island of St. Helena in the middle of nowhere, Atlantic Ocean. And they believe there's only 5,000 people buried there. So these are significant as well. But in addition to this, there's also a vibrant trade in illicit goods coming out of Africa. Now, the trade in illicit goods is actually the third largest illegal trade in the world. And by goods, I mean artifacts, I'm sorry. So this is behind the illegal trade in drugs, the illegal trade in arms. So this is a multi-billion-dollar industry trading illegal African artifacts. more diverse perspectives. A larger presence of black archaeologists doesn't guarantee the proper investigation or care, but it should help to establish connections between communities and archaeologists, and should help to add diversity of perspectives, as would be the case with the Admiral Liberty Field and other minorities as well. So what are some possible solutions? Again, 1978, in the same article, Dr. Drake noted that there are 3 major concerns that relate to blacks getting involved in higher education. One is the idea of knowledge of and accessibility to courses in the field, i.e. we need to have more courses in archaeology. 2 is the state of the job market. 3, the relevance to black achievement and liberation. And I believe this could start as a starting point, serve as a starting point to try to address some of these issues. Another possibility would be to look at the scholarships and fellowships geared specifically towards minorities. Drake noted that many of the early African-American anthropologists were Rosenwald Fellows, and that included Jordan Hurston, and that included Catherine Dunnavant. Additionally, anthropology and archaeology programs should be encouraged at historically black colleges and universities. While there are currently archaeologists on faculty at some of these institutions, as well as field schools for students to get involved in, none of them offer degrees in anthropology. Howard just closed their program, I think it was 3 years ago. And yeah, the last graduating class I think is coming out next year. And then finally is the need for professional organizations. The Association of Black Anthropologists was founded in the early 1970s, and from there we've seen a growth in the amount of blacks in anthropology. I can't say that it was the association that was responsible for that, but I think it definitely helped nurture that process in neighboring space. So with that, I believe all research should in turn lead to some type of action. So what have we done? We started a Society for Black Archaeologists. The Society of Black Archaeologists is more of a network at this point, and it's very small. But what we're trying to do is to try to address some of these issues that we see. We've cited 4 key points in which we hope to address. One is to lobby on behalf of and ensure the proper treatment of African and African diasporic material culture. To promote more blacks to enter the field of archaeology, to raise and address concerns related to African peoples worldwide, to make sure that the archaeological research relates specifically to issues that people are dealing with today. And then finally, to highlight the past and present achievements and contributions blacks have made to the field of archaeology. Now again, we're very small right now, but what we do hope to do is we hope to, once we gain a firm foundation, we hope to expand it to people who may not necessarily identify as African descendant, but who are willing to and very inspired by some of these principles. So that's where we're at today. We've been studying, there are really a number of reasons why I did this presentation, knowing that archaeologists weren't meant to be in the room. For one, I just wanted to show that we've been studying and making contributions to various disciplines from very early on, whether or not we were professionally trained in it. Some of this can be seen in the work of W.B. Du Bois, if you want to look at more formally, Philadelphia Negro, the first empirical sociological study. Not very many people read in sociology classes, if anybody does. And there's also informal organizations such as the Negro Historical Society and so forth. We have these reading groups. I also wanted to voice that there's a need to get more female voices and to uncover similar histories of these throughout other parts of the diaspora, including Latin America, the Caribbean, as well as in Europe, and as well as on the continent. Because blacks on the continent have been doing archaeology since, I don't even know when that started. Diop was doing stuff in 1920, and I'm sure it was done before. But I would like to throw it out there and say that I think every discipline at least has one Leo Hansberry. And on top of that, I would encourage professors to push their students to look into these histories and to look into these origins. And then I would encourage you all as students to then go on and uncover the significant contributions that have been made in your respective disciplines outside of the traditional academy. So with that, I'll close and you can field questions and any other type of discussion. Thank you.
So we got about 15 minutes and Justin will take some questions. But before he starts taking questions, because sometimes that process can go long, I wanted to just highlight a couple of upcoming lectures that we have in our series for this semester. I'll give you one date and I'll give you a couple of titles. So one upcoming lecture is Media Influences on African American Adolescent Girls by Kenesha Bird. That's coming up. When Attitudes Kill, the Legal Construction of Racial Discrimination in Healthcare. That's coming up. And our next lecture on the 30th of this month is Informal Economic Participation as an Element of Social Capital, Miami as a Case, by LaToya Hunter. So you can come back if that gave you a little taste. Come on back to us. But now Justin will take some questions. We appreciate you coming. Thank you very much.
Before I take questions too, I just want to announce that there's going to be a group of us in anthropology getting together here next Wednesday to start a reading group to kind of talk about some of these sources that we don't read in traditional classes. We'll start with Faye Harris's Decolonizing Anthropology, and then from there we'll decide as a group where we read. Everybody's welcome to that. That's 5 o'clock Wednesday. This place. I can drop something about it.
Yes, I do.
All right, and that's your question.
Does Hansberry have any memoirs or anything written that details his relationship with his peers or just his relationship with people in the academy? I guess, how did you come across all this information? So I can come across it.
Right. I always saw his picture up in the history department at Howard University, but I didn't begin to explore him until 2 weeks ago. Yeah. And just because people always say you need to know who Hansberry is, but nobody mentioned them in any of our classes. So there was ever a need to go out and look for him. But it's significant because a friend of mine is doing his PhD dissertation on the development of Africana studies. And he's arguing that Africana studies doesn't begin at San Francisco State University. It begins when the first black people opened up the first books and began to wonder why they looked like what they looked like and why they're in the situation that they're in and why they got into the way that they're today. So he traces it all the way back to there. But William Lee Hansberry was very instrumental in establishing some of these early disciplinary work. To answer your question, there is no book written on Hansberry yet. There was 2 dissertations published about his life. One was a master's thesis and one was actually a PhD dissertation. And not surprisingly, both of them were published under the heavy influence of Dr. John Henry Clark, who was a student of Hansberry's. So nothing's been published yet. I know the person who wrote the PhD dissertation is talking about publishing a book, but he published that dissertation early 2000s, late 90s. And I believe his papers are Howard University.
I was looking at that University of Florida 2012. With the blacks runaway to Florida and the Indians dashing down for safety to Florida and the intermixing, are you finding a Florida history either coming by way of Native Americans that includes the black overlap and intermarriage and community, or black bringing in the Native American in Florida?
Definitely. Actually, archaeologist by the name of Terry White graduated from here a couple years ago. I'm not sure exactly when. But he did his PhD dissertation on, I think it was Fort Mose, and the history of the black Seminoles and the relationships that they had to one another. And some of the earliest black anthropologists have also done research. Lawrence Foster, the first African-American anthropologist with a PhD, he did his dissertation on Native American-black relations. So a lot of that history has been written. A lot of it is still in dissertation form, so it's not in official books. But I can give you my University of Florida account information.
So you might be able to get your history through the Native American Association also.
Yeah, definitely. Never remains the case.
I know you said the Black Society of Archaeologists is still at network level, but you guys are planning on promoting interest of blacks into the field of archaeology. I want to know how you're planning on doing that.
Well, there's actually a young woman who graduated from Berkeley recently with a PhD in archaeology. She set up a nonprofit organization specifically targeting elementary and middle school students to make them aware of archaeological research. And she's doing that work in DC right now. So one of our hopes is that we'll be able to tag along with that, make it a little bigger, expand the high school, get people interested in it. Another way we plan on doing it is we actually are talking about starting an oral history program where we'll actually ask archaeologists when they go out to the field to interview some of the people that work with them. And then from that, we'll be able to use those interviews to kind of write papers, get their voices out there, and discuss the importance that these people have played. Because a lot of archaeologists don't just stumble upon sites or find sites. They get directed to these sites by people. And people who oftentimes know more history and are better aware of just the background behind the sites.
Can you direct us to your site?
Can I direct you to our site? I don't know if that is up here. Let's see. It's still in the early phases. Sorry, you have to bear with me. We'll be changing what we're doing as well. Alright, so this is our site. This is something that we drafted up very recently. You know, some people are now. We've actually presented at the National Council for Black Studies Conference in Georgia this weekend. From that, we got solicitations to present at the upcoming Asylum Conference. We're trying to get this to not only be an archaeological discussion, but to be a Black Studies discussion as well. And so if any of y'all are interested in presenting papers, please let us know. Oral history project, we're still working on trying to expand the content. We have a blog as well. Members projects, we're going to include some of the projects some of our current members are working on. Field school opportunities, the Ace Hillier Restoration Project. I highly recommend all of you look into it. They're actually soliciting archaeologists to come on board, and you don't have to be an archaeologist or be heavily involved in archaeology. You just have to have an interest. And they take people out to Egypt every year and conduct excavations on the 26th dynasty tomb. So this would have been one of the ones that came originally. It's definitely powerful. And yeah, you can feel free to solicit them and hop on board with that. And then we have great insights.
Before I got here, I was in K through 12. And, as a counselor, I would run these groups, and I did something on like racial identity. But part of it was like every week I would bring up like a historical fact, that stuff that I was reading about, and I didn't start reading about until graduate school, right? And I was like, dang, you know. So, but it was interesting because people was like, you know, why do you want to do that? There's no racism, nothing going on in school. I said, because they need to know about some stuff. And so it was interesting that when I started to talk about like some of these historical facts, they were like, what? Like, but they were like, when I would be talking to them, they're like, just into it, and like, man, really? And so for me, I was always like, man, if they would have taught this in high school, I would have actually paid attention in history class. And so when you talk about like archaeology, I was just telling Angelia earlier, I was like, man, that's dinosaurs. Like when all I think about is dinosaurs, right? But you know, when you're talking about, all I'm thinking about is like kids, how they're so curious, and that's like interactive. You're digging up, you know. So I'm just thinking about ways. You already said she's doing it. Somebody's doing it in DC, trying to get in the schools already. So I just think it's definitely a direction that you need to go, and possibly work with school counselors, and you know, some counselors might help you out. Some might be like, yeah, whatever. But I just think it's great, especially for elementary, but then also for the high schools who's getting ready to go to college who don't know about the degree, because you know it's interesting. I didn't know none of this stuff. So.
It's powerful. I mean, people have been digging sites related to black people since early 40s in America. George Washington Carver's house was excavated in the 1950s. W.B. Du Bois' house is being excavated now. So a lot of these sites relate to other fields as well. But also, I could say I was actually working at Liberty Hall in Jamaica a couple of years back, teaching an after-school program there. And I remember I asked the students, what's the oldest black person you can think of? Like looking back in history, what's the oldest black person you can name? And these kids were about middle school age, and they looked around the walls and saw a painting of Marcus Garvey. And said, Marcus Garvey. And on the one hand, I started laughing, and then on the other hand, I was like, that's a shame. Because they don't see themselves prior to 1920. They just don't see themselves in history, period. So if you don't see yourself in history, you're not a part of it. So why are you going to study history? Why are you going to study archaeology? You're going to think about everything moving forward. You're not going to think about what happened to you in the past or why it's moving. So hopefully this moves sense.
So just to piggyback off of what he was saying, do black archaeologists have different type of pedagogical methods or different ideas of collaboration when they go out into the field?
It's not like a guarantee if you're a black archaeologist you're going to research this way. And it's not a guarantee if you're a white archaeologist you're going to research this way. But it has helped to bring more ideas and theories out to the field. Whitney Battle-Baptiste argues for black feminist archaeology, and she describes what that is in more detail about looking at intersections of race, class, gender as well, and how that plays out in archaeological research. And it allows us to take sites such as Du Bois' home, and instead of focusing on Du Bois, focus on the women who raised him, and so forth. So it adds a different perspective. That being said, people have been talking about this as well in the past, but I think what's most important is that blacks in any discipline tend to do some type of research related to black studies, whether or not they know who the first person was or not. And because of that, we develop, I'm not going to say different intellectual genealogies, but in a sense, we develop different intellectual genealogies. So we might reference people like John Henry Clark, who's never going to be mentioned in any of our classes, but who some mentor or advisor told us we need to know. Or we might mention William Leo Hansberry, who somebody had a picture of on their wall or introduced you to. So these are things that I think relate to issues of race in archaeology, but again, like I said, it's not that stuff.
Would you say it's just a matter of incorporating these people into just the full, telling the whole story? So, you know, it's not, it's like this, if they're not there, then